It was a quiet afternoon in a busy city, and the young man walked through the parking lot, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. He was dressed sharply in a sleek black suit, the fabric smooth against his skin, and a neat bow tie that added a touch of elegance to his look. His goal was simple. He had an important meeting coming up with the company's top executives. As he walked towards the building, he felt a sense of pride. This meeting could change everything for him. He was young, ambitious, and ready to make his mark in the business world. But as he approached the entrance, something unusual happened. Two police officers were patrolling the parking lot. The first officer, a middle-aged white man with a stern expression, looked at the young man and immediately took notice of his appearance. The officer's eyes narrowed as he assessed him, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. Without thinking twice, he began walking toward the young man, his boots clicking on the ground. The young man had no idea what was coming. He had been focused on the meeting ahead, but now his attention shifted to the approaching officer. He could feel the officer's gaze on him, and his heart rate picked up a little. What had he done wrong? Was there something suspicious about his appearance? He stood still, trying to keep calm, but his mind raced. He didn't know if he should smile, greet the officer, or just stay silent. The officer stopped right in front of him, his expression hard and unfriendly. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, his tone sharp. "This is private property, and you don't look like you're supposed to be here." The young man was taken aback by the officer's directness. He was dressed professionally, but the officer seemed to have already made up his mind. "I'm on my way to a meeting," the young man said politely, trying to remain calm. "I work at the company across the street." But the officer wasn't convinced. "Yeah, sure," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A young guy like you, wearing a suit, just walking through a parking lot. I don't buy it." The young man felt a wave of frustration, but didn't let it show. He repeated his response, telling the officer once again that he was headed to an important meeting. He tried to stand tall, hoping that his professionalism would be enough to convince the officer. But the officer wasn't listening. He crossed his arms, as if preparing for an argument, and didn't budge. "You don't look like someone who belongs here," the officer said, his tone more forceful now. "You should be more careful about where you go and who you talk to." The young man felt his patience beginning to slip. This wasn't just a routine question anymore. The officer was treating him as if he were a criminal, judging him without reason, based only on his appearance. But he stayed composed, keeping his emotions in check. After all, he couldn't afford to get upset. Not now. Not in front of this officer. "I don't know why you're assuming the worst about me," the young man said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here on business, and I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's eyes flicked up and down, scanning the young man as if trying to find some flaw, some reason to justify his suspicions. The young man could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the judgment that seemed to radiate from him. He was well aware of how people often treated him, especially in situations like this. Being a young black man meant that others frequently looked at him with suspicion, simply because of the color of his skin. The officer wasn't finished. "I'm just making sure everything's okay," he said, his voice softening but still carrying an edge. "You never know what kind of people show up around here." At this, the young man's patience was wearing thinner. He could feel his anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he knew better than to let it out. He'd been in similar situations before, and he understood how important it was to remain calm, even in the face of such obvious prejudice. He straightened his posture and decided it was time to end this encounter. "I'm not a threat," he said firmly. "I'm just here to do my job." The officer still wasn't satisfied. He glanced over at his partner, a younger officer standing off to the side, who had been quietly observing the exchange. The younger officer was clearly unsure of what to do, not wanting to get involved in something that seemed to be escalating. "Just wait here," the officer said abruptly, before pulling out his radio to make a call, still watching the young man closely. The young man sighed quietly. He didn't know what to think anymore. This wasn't how he had imagined his day going. All he had wanted was to walk into that building and prove himself, to show the world that he was capable of more than what people saw on the outside. But here he was, standing in a parking lot, treated like a suspect for no reason at all. As the officer continued his questioning, the young man remained quiet. His thoughts began to race, but he focused on staying composed. He knew this was a test, not just from the officer, but from the world. It was a test of his character, of his ability to stay calm under pressure, and of his strength to rise above the assumptions people made about him. Little did he know, this moment would not only change the course of his day, but also set the stage for an even more shocking twist ahead. The young man stood there, the sounds of the city humming in the background, while the officer continued to question him, as though he were guilty of something. The officer's voice was sharp and commanding, showing no sign of backing down. The young man could feel the eyes of the other officer watching him, and he couldn't help but notice the way the first officer's gaze lingered. It was uncomfortable, as if the officer was judging him based on something other than his words. "Why are you out here in a suit?" the officer asked, his voice more dismissive than before. "People in your position don't just walk around like this. What's your real story?" The young man's heart rate picked up a little, but he refused to show any sign of nervousness. He was being treated like a criminal without any reason, simply because of how he looked. It was hard to keep his composure, but he had learned from experience that reacting with anger would only make things worse. He needed to stay calm, no matter how unfair the situation felt. "I already told you, I'm here for a meeting," the young man said again, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building inside him. He had expected this encounter to be brief, just a simple check-in. But instead, it was turning into something much more uncomfortable. The officer seemed to be looking for a reason to escalate things, searching for any excuse to prove that he was right to be suspicious. The officer ignored his response and looked the young man up and down again, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're really making this difficult, aren't you?" the officer said, his tone now dripping with condescension. "You don't look like someone who belongs here. I've seen plenty of people like you before, and they're never just here for a meeting." The words stung more than the young man had expected. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on how he looked, but it still hurt every time. He was a young black man, and people often judged him without ever taking the time to really see who he was or what he was capable of. But this time, it felt different. This time, the officer wasn't just questioning him. He was belittling him, treating him like he was less than he was. The officer had made up his mind that the young man didn't belong there. And no matter how much the young man explained, nothing would change that. The young man tried to keep his cool, but he could feel his hands clenching into fists, his mind racing with frustration. "What do you want me to do?" the young man finally asked, his voice now carrying a hint of disbelief. "Do you want me to prove something to you? I'm just here to work like anyone else. I don't need to explain myself." The officer wasn't finished, though. He stepped closer, now almost towering over the young man. His presence was imposing, and it felt like the young man was shrinking under the weight of his judgment. The officer's eyes narrowed as he spoke again. "I think you're hiding something," he said, his voice low and accusing. "People don't just come around here looking like you, wearing a fancy suit, acting like they belong. I don't believe you." The words felt like a slap in the face. The young man had never felt so humiliated, so small, in his life. He had worked so hard to get to where he was. He had earned his place in that building, earned the right to be there, but the officer couldn't see any of that. All he saw was someone who didn't fit the image he had in his mind of what a person like him should look like. The young man opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the officer raised his hand, as if to silence him. "I don't need to hear it," the officer said, cutting him off. "You're clearly lying about why you're here. I'm going to have to call this in." As the officer turned to his radio, the young man's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe this was happening. All he had wanted was to get through the day and do his job. But now, because of his appearance and the assumptions the officer had made, he was being treated like a criminal. It felt like a punch to the gut, but the young man refused to break. He couldn't. Not in front of this officer. He had to hold his ground, even if it felt like the whole world was against him in that moment. The second officer, who had been standing quietly off to the side, shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. He glanced back and forth between his partner and the young man, clearly unsettled by the situation. He had witnessed countless interactions like this before, but this one felt different. There was something about the way the first officer was acting that didn't sit right with him. Still, he didn't speak up. He didn't know how to. It was easier to stay silent, to not get involved. But deep down, he knew this wasn't right. He could see the way the young man was standing, the way his shoulders were squared with quiet dignity, even in the face of this unfair treatment. As the first officer continued to speak into his radio, the young man fought to keep his emotions in check. He felt his hands shaking slightly, but he was determined not to let the officer see it. He didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his words had hurt. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to focus on the calmness he had always relied on in moments like this. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, why did it always have to be this way? Why was it that, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he accomplished, he would always be seen through the lens of someone else's assumptions? He thought about the life he had built for himself, the education he had fought for, and the goals he had yet to achieve. And for a brief moment, it felt like all of that was being erased by a single moment of prejudice. But he wouldn't let it break him. Not today. Not ever. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second. The officer continued to speak into his radio, his back turned slightly to the young man, as though he were a minor nuisance to be dealt with. The young man stood there, still, trying his best to keep his composure. He knew that the officer's behavior was based entirely on assumptions, on a prejudice that ran deep, and it made the whole situation feel worse. But he refused to give in to the anger that was building inside him. He had worked too hard for everything he had achieved, and he wasn't about to let this moment destroy all of that. As the officer continued his radio call, the younger officer glanced at the young man again. The look in his eyes was one of confusion, maybe even a bit of guilt, but he didn't speak up. He seemed unsure of how to intervene, unsure of how to stop what was happening. Instead, he just stood there, watching. The young man could feel the other officer's eyes on him, but it didn't help the situation. It only reminded him that this wasn't just one officer making a mistake. It was a whole system of bias that had been in place for far too long. The young man's patience was wearing thin. The more the officer ignored his explanations, the more his mind raced. Why did the officer refuse to believe him? Why was it so hard for some people to accept that he could be more than just a stereotype? He had worked hard for everything he had. The young man was an up-and-coming professional, with his life ahead of him. Yet here he was, standing in a parking lot, treated like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong. He could feel his frustration bubbling to the surface, but he held it back, reminding himself that getting angry wouldn't help. The officer's rude comments and dismissive attitude only served to make him more determined to prove that he was worthy of respect. He wanted to show the officer that he was capable, that he was more than the officer's assumptions, but he didn't want to escalate things further. He had learned from experience that staying calm was the best way to deal with situations like this. The officer, still speaking into the radio, finally turned back to the young man. "You need to wait here until I get clearance," he said, his voice flat, as if the young man was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. The young man nodded, though he felt a wave of anger rise within him. He knew he was being treated unfairly, but he also knew there was nothing he could do about it right now. He could feel the eyes of the second officer on him, but no one was speaking up. No one was standing up for him. It was a helpless feeling, but the young man refused to let it show. His thoughts turned inward as he waited. He had always been taught to rise above the prejudice and hatred that others threw his way. But it wasn't always easy. His entire life had been shaped by the struggles of being a black man in a world that often saw him as less than. The constant battle to prove himself, to show that he was just as capable and worthy as anyone else. It was exhausting, and it felt like the weight of the world was always on his shoulders. But he kept going, because that's what he had been taught to do. He knew that if he didn't fight for his place, no one else would. Still, there was a part of him that wondered if it would ever get easier. Would he ever be seen for who he truly was, instead of what people assumed he was? Would the world ever stop judging him based on his skin color, or would he always have to fight against that prejudice? It was a question he had asked himself countless times before, but he had never been able to find an answer. The officer, still standing nearby, seemed oblivious to the thoughts running through the young man's head. He was too caught up in his own sense of authority to notice the impact of his actions. The young man took a deep breath and reminded himself that this was just another challenge he would have to face. It wasn't the first time he had been judged for the color of his skin, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, something felt different. Today, he felt more determined than ever to rise above the assumptions and prove his worth. The officer finished his radio call and stood silently for a moment, clearly expecting the young man to say something. But the young man remained silent, his thoughts a mix of frustration and resolve. He wouldn't give this officer the satisfaction of seeing him upset. Instead, he would remain calm, as he always did, and wait for the situation to resolve itself. The second officer, still standing to the side, shifted his weight uneasily. He had been watching the exchange with increasing discomfort, but he hadn't said a word. He could tell that the young man was being treated unfairly, but he didn't know how to make it stop. He could feel the tension in the air, and he knew that this was a moment where things could easily escalate. But for now, he stayed quiet, unsure of what to do. The young man tried to push the feelings of frustration aside. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control them. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life, and he wasn't about to let this officer or anyone else take that away from him. The situation was difficult, but it wasn't the end of his journey. He still had a meeting to attend, and that was what he was focused on now. In the midst of all this, a small part of him felt a sense of strength growing inside him. He had survived this far, despite all the obstacles life had thrown his way. And he would continue to survive, no matter how many people tried to put him down or hold him back. Today, the young man had a choice. He could let the officer's prejudice define him, or he could rise above it. And he was determined to choose the latter. The young man stood there, trying to control the storm of emotions brewing inside him. It felt like the world was pushing him down, like every step forward he took, someone was always there to remind him of his place. He had learned to fight through these moments, to push past the negativity and assumptions. But it wasn't easy. It never was. The young man had built his life with effort and determination, but in moments like this, it felt like all of that hard work meant nothing. The officer, still glaring at him, seemed to have forgotten that the young man was a person. He wasn't seeing the story, the long hours of study, the sacrifices the young man had made, or the goals he was working towards. All he saw was someone who didn't belong in the place he was in. It wasn't the first time the young man had faced this type of treatment, but today it felt different. Today he was determined to stand his ground, to not let the officer's judgment break him. As the officer continued to bark orders into his radio, the second officer stood awkwardly to the side. He wasn't involved in the exchange, but the discomfort on his face was clear. He kept glancing from the first officer to the young man, torn between what was right and what was easy. He knew this wasn't how things should be going, but he didn't know how to intervene. There was a power dynamic here, one that made him feel small and helpless. The young man could see the second officer's hesitation, but he didn't expect him to do anything. It was a painful reminder that not everyone was ready to challenge the status quo. For the young man, this moment felt like a test. He had always been taught that challenges were opportunities for growth. He had been through many difficult situations in his life, but none had felt as personal as this one. The officer's dismissiveness was more than just an obstacle. It was an attack on who he was. He felt a surge of anger, but he quickly pushed it away. Anger wasn't the answer. He couldn't let this officer win. He couldn't let anyone make him feel less than he was. The officer finally turned back to him after finishing his call. "I'm still waiting for confirmation," he said flatly, not even looking at the young man. The words hit the young man like a punch. It was clear that the officer wasn't going to back down, and it was clear that the young man wasn't going to get an apology. All he wanted was to get past this moment, to be treated like anyone else, to be recognized for his abilities, not judged for his appearance. The young man took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been in situations like this before, where his worth was questioned simply because of the way he looked. But there was something about this situation that made him feel like he had more to lose. The job he was working for, the life he had built, everything depended on how he handled this moment. He couldn't let it slip away because of someone else's ignorance. Just then, something unexpected happened. The second officer, who had been quiet this whole time, took a step forward. He looked at the young man, and for the first time, the young man saw a look of resolve in his eyes. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to make the young man pause. Could this officer actually do something to help him? Or was he just feeling guilty for standing by and watching everything unfold? The second officer cleared his throat. "Hey, Jim," he said softly, addressing his partner. "I think we might have this wrong." The first officer looked at him, clearly irritated by the interruption. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone dismissive. But the second officer didn't back down. "I mean, this guy doesn't look like trouble to me. Maybe we should stop assuming things about him," the second officer said, his voice more confident now. "We've got no reason to hold him here." For a moment, the first officer just stared at him. The tension between the two officers was palpable, and the young man could sense the change in the air. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, something would change. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally seeing him for who he was, instead of just the color of his skin. The first officer's face reddened, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to argue. But then he paused. He glanced at the young man, and something shifted in his expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Maybe it was the second officer's words that planted the seed of doubt in his mind. Maybe he had started to question the assumptions he had made. Or maybe, just maybe, the young man's calm resilience had made him see that he wasn't dealing with someone to be looked down on. The first officer grunted, clearly frustrated. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll call it off. But don't let me catch you here again." The young man nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had been holding back so much for so long, trying to maintain his dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect. But now, with the situation diffused, he was filled with a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and a strange sense of victory. He had stood his ground, and he had earned his right to be there. As he turned to leave, the second officer gave him a small, almost apologetic nod. The young man didn't say anything, but he appreciated it. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that not all was lost. Not everyone was blind to the injustices that happened every day. Some people, even when it was hard, chose to do what was right. With his head held high, the young man walked away. He still had a meeting to attend, and now he was more determined than ever to prove that he belonged in that space, because he did. He had earned it, and nothing would take that away from him. Today had been a difficult test, but it was one he had passed. As the young man walked away from the parking lot, he felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had just faced one of the toughest moments of his life, but in some ways, he also felt stronger than ever. It wasn't just about what had happened with the officer. It was about the silent victory that came with standing his ground. The young man had endured countless moments where people judged him based on his appearance, but this time, something had shifted inside him. He wasn't just surviving these situations anymore. He was starting to take control. His mind raced as he made his way toward the building where he had his meeting. The meeting he had been preparing for all week. It wasn't just another business discussion. This was a pivotal moment for him, a chance to prove that his hard work, his skills, and his character were the things that truly defined him, not the prejudice others tried to impose on him. But as he walked, a thought kept nagging at him. Was everything going to change now? Would people always see him as someone to be underestimated? Was he destined to fight against this stereotype for the rest of his life? He pushed the thoughts aside. He had learned to focus on the things that mattered, to stop worrying about what he couldn't control. He had worked hard to reach this point, and nothing, no matter how hard people tried to drag him down, would take that away. But as he approached the building's entrance, something strange happened. The young man's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a friend or colleague. But when he saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was an email from his boss, the CEO of the company where he had recently been hired. The subject line read, "Urgent. Meeting details changed." The young man frowned. He hadn't heard anything about a change in the schedule. He opened the email quickly and skimmed the message. It read, "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we've had to make a last-minute adjustment to today's meeting. The location and time are the same, but I need you to meet with the new manager of our department before the meeting. This is very important. Please be there on time." The young man's mind raced. A new manager, but who could this be? And why hadn't he heard anything about it? His heart started to pound in his chest. He had worked so hard to be in the position he was in. Was this some sort of test? Was it a way for the company to see if he could handle an unexpected situation? He didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't going to let it shake his focus. After all, he had faced much worse moments. This was just another challenge, one that he was more than ready for. With the email still open in his hand, he entered the building and made his way to the elevator. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to calm down. The meeting could be anything, and he had to stay focused. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as he stepped inside, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He had been in this building many times before, but today felt different. It was like the world was shifting around him, like everything he had worked for was hanging by a thread, waiting to either break or come together in the most unexpected way. As the elevator ascended, the young man's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from his colleague, Josh. Josh was one of the few people who knew about his struggles in the workplace. He had always been the supportive friend, even when things seemed tough. The text message read, "Hey, I just heard some news. The new manager, the one you're meeting with today, is someone you might know." The young man's heart skipped a beat. Someone I might know. The words echoed in his mind. Who could this be? He had met many people throughout his career, but none that he would consider close enough to be a manager. But then, a sudden thought hit him. Could it be the officer from earlier? Could the same person who had treated him so unfairly be the one he was supposed to meet with now? No, that couldn't be right. He tried to shake the thought from his mind, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. After all, the officer had been on the phone earlier, speaking to someone. What if that call had been about the young man's meeting? What if that officer was somehow involved in the decision to bring him into the company? It seemed too strange to be true, but nothing felt impossible anymore. The elevator doors opened, and the young man stepped out into the sleek hallway that led to the conference rooms. He could feel his pulse quicken as he walked toward the door of the meeting room. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was determined to face it head-on. No matter who he was about to meet, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. He had been prepared for moments like this. As he reached the door, he took one final deep breath. With a steady hand, he pushed the door open and walked into the conference room. But what he saw next left him frozen in place. Standing at the head of the table was none other than the officer from earlier, the same man who had humiliated him in the parking lot. The young man's heart dropped. This was the last person he had ever expected to see in this role. The officer, now in a crisp business suit, looked up as the young man entered the room. For a moment, there was silence. Neither of them spoke. The young man's mind was reeling. What was going on? Why was this happening? Was this all some kind of test? The officer cleared his throat, his eyes now meeting the young man's. "I think it's time we talk," he said, his voice unexpectedly calm. The young man stood frozen at the door, unable to fully process what he was seeing. The officer from earlier, the same person who had humiliated him in the parking lot, was now standing in front of him in a business suit, looking every bit the part of a successful manager. It was almost surreal, like the universe had thrown a curveball, and now he was expected to somehow hit it. His mind was racing, and he felt a wave of confusion flood over him. The officer, the man he had assumed was just a small part of the system of injustice he had been battling for years, was now in a position of power, and not just any position, but the very role he had worked so hard to be in. How could this be? How could someone who had treated him like that only a few hours ago be in charge now? The officer gave him a small nod, as though he expected the young man to speak. The silence in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. The young man's chest tightened as he realized that he was not just facing an uncomfortable situation, but something much bigger. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about understanding how this twisted turn of events had come to be. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the young man broke the silence. You're my new manager." His voice was steady, but inside, his emotions were all over the place. He couldn't quite make sense of it. The officer, now dressed in a sharp suit, seemed to almost hesitate for a moment before responding. "Yes," he said, his voice unexpectedly calm. "I'm the new manager of this department. I'm also your superior now." The words hit the young man like a punch to the gut. Superior? How could this man, who had shown such disrespect for him just hours ago, now be in charge of his career? How could someone who had made him feel small, belittled, and humiliated now hold the power to shape his future? The young man's mind was racing, his thoughts a blur of frustration, confusion, and disbelief. Before he could say anything else, the officer continued. "I owe you an apology," he said, his tone surprisingly sincere. "I know I treated you unfairly earlier. That wasn't right. And I'm sorry." The young man was taken aback. He hadn't expected this, certainly not this level of honesty and remorse. It wasn't the apology he had imagined. It wasn't some half-hearted, forced attempt to make things right. This was different. The officer seemed genuine, like he had truly reflected on his actions and understood the impact they had on the young man. The young man didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he was ready to accept the apology yet. It was hard, too hard, to simply forgive someone who had made him feel so powerless, so small. But at the same time, he knew that holding on to this anger wasn't going to help him move forward. He had come so far, and he couldn't let one bad encounter derail everything he had worked for. "Why did you do it?" the young man asked, his voice a little shakier now. "Why treat me like that? You didn't even know me." The officer sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair, his eyes downcast for a moment. "I can't give you a good reason for what I did," he admitted. "I've been in this job a long time, and sometimes you start to think you're above people. It's easy to make assumptions. I've seen people like you before, young, ambitious, maybe trying to make it in a world that's harder than it should be. But that doesn't excuse the way I treated you. It was wrong, and I want to make it right." The young man sat down in the chair across from him, trying to digest everything that was being said. This wasn't the conversation he had imagined having when he walked into the room. This wasn't the confrontation he had prepared himself for. Instead of an argument, he was faced with someone who seemed genuinely regretful of his actions. "I don't know what to say," the young man admitted after a moment. "It's just hard to believe. A few hours ago, you were treating me like I didn't belong here, like I was less than you. And now you're telling me you're my manager." The officer nodded, his expression softening. "I understand why you'd feel that way," he said. "I can't erase what happened, but I can try to make it right moving forward. I know that's not much, but I want you to know that I'll be fair to you from now on. I'll treat you with respect." The young man's mind was still reeling, but something in the officer's voice told him that he was serious. He wasn't sure if he could completely trust him yet, but he could see the sincerity in his eyes. Maybe this was the first step toward a better future, one where he wouldn't have to constantly fight against assumptions and prejudice. "I appreciate that," the young man said slowly, finally letting go of some of the tension that had been building inside him. "But you have to understand, it's not just about what you did today. It's about the way people like you, people in power, see people like me. Every time something like this happens, it makes me question if I'll ever be seen for who I really am." The officer looked at him with understanding. "I get that," he said quietly, "and I can't promise that I'll change everything. But I can promise that I'll do my part. I'll make sure you're treated fairly. I'll make sure you have the opportunity to succeed." For a moment, there was a silence between them, but it wasn't the same kind of heavy silence that had filled the parking lot earlier. This was different. This felt like a new beginning. The young man didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it might just be a little bit brighter. As the conversation continued, the young man felt a mix of disbelief and hope rising within him. This wasn't a normal workplace interaction. It wasn't something you would expect from the rigid structures of corporate life, where hierarchy and power usually defined everything. But here he was, sitting across from a man who had treated him with disrespect only hours ago, yet was now apologizing and promising to do better. The young man couldn't quite understand how everything had shifted so quickly. From feeling humiliated and rejected by the officer's earlier actions to now being offered a chance at respect and fairness, it felt like a complete turn of events. Was it really possible for things to change so suddenly? Could the man who had once seen him as just another young guy trying to make it actually be the one to give him the opportunity to grow and succeed? "I want to believe you," the young man finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's not easy. You can't just erase everything that happened in a few words." The officer nodded, acknowledging the truth of the statement. "I know," he said softly, "and I wouldn't expect you to. It's going to take time, and I get that. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but I want to show you that I can be better, that I can be a kind of manager you deserve." For a moment, the young man was silent. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and despite everything, he wasn't ready to fully trust the officer. But as the silence stretched on, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this man was finally being genuine. It wasn't often that people admitted when they were wrong, especially in a world that often rewarded power over humility. The officer's willingness to take responsibility for his actions, to apologize without expecting anything in return, was rare, and in some strange way, it made the young man feel like he had a real chance to move forward. "I'm not asking for a free pass," the young man said, his voice steady but with a hint of warmth. "I just want to prove myself. I want to show you that I'm capable, that I'm not here just because of my background or the color of my skin. I'm here because of my skills, my drive, and my ambition." The officer's expression softened. "I believe that. I know what it's like to feel like people see you for something you're not. I know how it feels to have doors closed in your face before you even get a chance to knock. But if you're willing to work with me, I'll do everything in my power to make sure those doors stay open for you. You won't have to fight against prejudice here. I'll make sure of that." The young man felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't often that people in positions of power took a stand like this, not just for themselves but for others. The officer had the chance to bury the situation under the weight of his authority, but instead, he was trying to build something new, something based on trust, respect, and fairness. It was a refreshing change, a rare moment in a world that often made people feel invisible or insignificant because of their background. "Thank you," the young man said, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you for this opportunity. I'll work harder than you can imagine. I won't let you down." The officer gave him a small but genuine smile. "I don't doubt that for a second," he said. "I've seen the way you carry yourself. I know you're ready for what's ahead. But remember, this isn't just about what you do. It's about how we work together to make sure everyone here has the chance to succeed. No one should feel like they don't belong." As the young man sat there, feeling a sense of relief washing over him, he realized that this moment, this conversation, had changed everything. It wasn't just about a job or a title anymore. It was about something much bigger. The possibility of a world where people could rise above the labels and assumptions placed on them. A world where everyone, no matter their background, had a fair shot at success. And for the first time in a long time, the young man believed that it was possible. He stood up, extending his hand across the desk. "I'm ready," he said, looking the officer in the eye. "Let's do this together." The officer shook his hand firmly, a look of approval in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm confident we can do it." The young man smiled as he left the office, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. He knew that the road to success would be full of obstacles, but he was no stranger to overcoming them. With this new opportunity, this new partnership, he was ready to prove that anything was possible. As he walked through the building's halls, he felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He wasn't just a young man trying to survive in a world that often overlooked him. He was someone with value, with purpose, and for the first time in a long time, he could see his future clearly, a future where he would be respected for who he was, not judged by the way others saw him. This was just the beginning, and the young man knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it head on.